What gets the hey, Next deal about that wins the slow baby meal. I'm always none of models as never around guess me middle. You're cooking the wire buzzer, you're more how they is. Let me see that. Yeah, forget about the Peter. We taking more and more hell short to the number ringing in her. I'm poor game. Emma was the guy that I'm no so fish line that was sweet. I'm a stroke. No, you did it. We're all my skin. This is not good. I'm not fucking. Yeah, I'm ready. Good for so it's an usher. Most of them sit off at me, oceanos, Erasmus, das nicht. Eine Haus, wie die Grüne ist, was noch bei dir. Das Rot, Mias, sind deine Reichste, mich schwer, ruhig als ihr das Zeit. Morgen ist immer so ihr Wort, wie es riecht, du nimmst dich. So they go for Wendy Catney, the waste the one on the average life cash lost. I call my runners, my three as yeah, no it's never asked. Yeah, no it's never asked. Must not first one on me, Lord, good success. Yes, morning it was taking part on yeah, but they can't be worse. And more.